Lambeth 1888 resolution too. But they're still the same. All three statements of them are basically the same in slightly different language. What we see is that the church, the nature of the Episcopal Church was boiled down to these four principles that they could then say, we can compromise everything else, but these things we have to retain. Now, this was a long time ago, and in some respects, it seems like it's so long ago that it's not relevant any longer. But in 2000, when the Lutheran Church in the United States and the Episcopal Church went through a long, long process of deciding to come together and what they called recognize each other's orders. In other words, they made an agreement that would allow a small town to have an Episcopal Lutheran church or a Lutheran Episcopal church, or that would allow an Episcopal priest to serve a Lutheran church, or the other way around. That took a lot of effort on the parts of those people who do those kind of negotiations. And the thing that the Lutheran Church agreed to, because at this time, come in, at this time, 120 years later, they still weren't willing to compromise any of those things, and in particular, the historic episcopate. And we talked a little bit about the historic episcopate last week, I think. And I'm going to talk to you, just refresh your memory, and then I want to talk to you about how they decided they could establish the historic episcopate in the Lutheran Church. If you read the lectionary for today, Wednesday, not Sundays, but today, Wednesday, the Confession of Peter. And it has that passage where Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I build my church." He's talking to Simon. Most of the time throughout the New Testament, we hear about Simon Peter. But he was Simon almost until the very end, and Jesus changes his name to Peter. The word Peter means rock, and so he changes it and he says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And Peter goes on to become the first bishop of Rome, and as the first bishop of Rome, he participated in the consecration of all the bishops in the Roman Empire. And then as it spread out, the ones that had been consecrated by Peter were established as those who had the power to consecrate new bishops, right? On and on. So there's this unbroken chain from Jesus' hands on Peter's shoulders all the way down to today's bishops. And because at the time that Henry VIII lopped England off from the Catholic Church, all of those bishops in England had been consecrated already in the Roman Catholic Church and were part of the historic episcopate. So a big effort has been made to maintain that through the history of the church, including the United States. And it was actually the reason that in the United States, the Methodist Church was broken off from the Episcopal Church because they had consecrated bishops and priests outside of the historic episcopate. Once they got over here, it was complicated, and they just gave up and said, "We don't need to do that." And that was taken as a sign that they were going to go do their own thing, and they did. So that's why, even though the Wesley brothers, who are the founders of the Methodist Church, were Episcopal priests until they died, once they got over here to the United States, the Methodists didn't have enough patience to deal with all of the politics and so forth involved in getting a bishop from England to do the consecrations. Actually, the Episcopal Church sent bishops to Europe to be consecrated rather than bringing someone here. And at first, they couldn't get anyone in England to do that. So the first bishop that was consecrated, American bishop that was consecrated, was Bishop Seabury. And he had to go to Scotland to be consecrated by a bishop that had been part of the historic episcopate. So it goes on beyond that, in that each priest and deacon who's ordained has been ordained by someone who's part of that, so that it really pervades the whole church, this idea that we really descended from Jesus in a historical kind of way. So in 2000, when the Lutheran Church and the Episcopal Church were dealing with this thing about coming together and recognizing each other's orders, they couldn't just recognize all those bishops who had been consecrated outside of the historic tradition. And so what they decided was, and the Lutherans agreed, was that every time, for a whole generation, every time a Lutheran bishop is consecrated, an Episcopal bishop has to be present to lay his hands on the new bishop at his consecration. That's very interesting to me, because I can't imagine a church agreeing to that. But apparently, it is not only important to the Episcopal Church, it seems to be an important idea beyond our church. But these things that are mentioned in the quadrilateral are really important, and let's talk about what they are, because we're going to talk today about books, and I think that let's go to the bottom of page 877. The first one is that Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments, as containing all things necessary to salvation, and as being the rule and ultimate standard of faith. Now, this does not say, and is careful not to say, that everything in the Old and New Testament is necessary for salvation. It says that what is necessary is there, but there's a lot of other stuff there as well. And that's become a very important, we'll come back to how that works out to be important in today's world. Number two, the Apostles' Creed, which is a symbol of baptism, and the Nicene Creed as the sufficient statement of the Christian faith. And the Episcopal Church also considers the Athanasian Creed as a standard creed as well. And if you would like to see the Athanasian Creed, I'll tell you where to find it. Number three, the two sacraments ordained by Christ himself, baptism and the supper of the Lord, ministered with unfailing use of Christ's words of institution and of the elements ordained by him. So it's not okay to have just bread or to offer just bread or just wine. It's okay to take just bread or just wine, but not to simply offer one or the other. Now, that was compromised during the pandemic, and there was a great sigh of relief when people got back to both elements of communion. And finally, the historic episcopate, locally adapted in the methods of its administration to the varying needs of the nations and peoples, called of God into the unity of his church. So, those are the four things that the church doesn't want to mess with in any kind of negotiation with any other church, or even just in our own history. The four things that define who we are. And so let's start with the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments as containing all things necessary to salvation and as being the rule and ultimate standard of faith. Now, if you have visited lots of churches, then you know that in the Episcopal Church we read a monumental quantity of Scripture in every service. Many other churches will have their entire worship service, and it will be built around a single phrase. You know, a whole series of sermons can be built around God is love, right? Which is the shortest verse in the Bible. Or Jesus wept, or one of those. really short ones. Just an aside, my great-grandfather was a Methodist circuit rider. And my dad and his family had supper with them every Sunday night. And every child at the table was required to recite a Bible verse. And so all week my grandmother had to teach her children how to recite a Bible verse, starting when they were 2. And she's the only person I've ever known in my life who knew the whole Bible in order by length of verse. So there are lots of Bibles, lots of different translations of the Bible, hundreds of them. Some are substantially more accurate translations than others. Some of the old translations, like the King James Version, which was a fairly accurate translation at its time, are not considered so accurate anymore because the meanings of the words they used have changed. The King James Version was translated, I think, in 1611, sometime like that, just around that time. Words like awesome. Awesome used to mean something that so amazing that it engendered fear. Awe was synonymous with fear. Not fear like scared to death, but fear like just so impressive that it made you cower in its presence, that kind of fear. We don't use that word that way anymore. There are hundreds of words whose meanings have changed to the extent that that translation of the Bible is just too old to be really valuable. It is, however, the King James Version is the one Bible that when you hear people quoting the Bible, they're most likely quoting. All of those phrases that we have in our vernacular, in our regular conversational English from the Bible, generally have come from that. And we've just been passed down for a long time. It was the first Bible written in English and available for lots of people to have in their hands. So obviously it had a big impact. Lots and lots of people in this country have learned to read, sitting by the fire, reading the King James Version of the Bible. That was a very strong tradition in early America when people were living in rural areas where there wasn't a school and their mothers were teaching them. It was after the meal had been cleared away, and they would sit down and they would learn to reading the King James Version of the Bible. So it has played a really big role in our history, not just the Episcopal Church's history, but the history of our country and our society. About 1970-ish, a group of about 60 scholars gathered in New Haven, Connecticut, and they went back to all of the extant. Do you know what that means? It means still existing early copies, manuscript copies of the Bible. Some of them all the way back to ancient Hebrew and Greek. And started from the beginning. They weren't translating translations. So before that, a lot of the translations had been translated from Latin. And that Latin translation had been made in the 11th century. So, the more times you translate something, the longer the line of translation, the less accurate it becomes. So this was a big deal. The RSV was the outcome of that group, the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, it's called. Not too long after that, another group of people went through that same translation and made it more inclusive by changing man or mankind to men and women or humankind. Just the general consensus was that man, if it wasn't about a person, if it was talking about in general, men in general, included the whole world. But to make that more specific, They went through and made it more inclusive. They did not change the translation beyond that. That's the New Revised Standard Version. Now, every one of them goes by initials, almost every one of them. The Roman Catholic Church typically uses the NIV, which is the New International Version of the Bible. And it's a great translation. There's nothing wrong with it. The Episcopal Church uses the NRSV, which is the New Revised Standard Version. And you will see, if you find Bibles in the pews of a church, it will usually be the NRSV. This is one of those things, New Revised Standard Version, with the Apocrypha. Now, I'm about to tell you about the Apocrypha, but the Apocrypha is a part of the Bible that is included in the Roman Catholic Church's Bibles and in the Anglican or Episcopal Church's Bibles, but most Protestants don't have it in their Bible. So I had this one day when this really uppity guy was introduced to me. He was the new Baptist pastor in Miami Springs where I worked, and he looked at me and he said, "At your seminary, did they teach you the whole Bible?" And he was referring to the very recent consecration of Gene Robinson in New Hampshire, who was an openly gay man, and that was what he was like. Did they include Romans, where he thought that there was evidence that that shouldn't have happened? And I said, "Oh yes, the whole Bible, and way more than you ever had," because we have the Apocrypha. So let me just show you. I'm just going to hold this up to you so you can see. The Old Testament is the story of the Hebrew existence for about 4,000 years. So it's about this much of the Bible. This is the story of the Hebrew people and their entire history and all the prophecy and all the laws. And then we have a little section that is the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha were writings that came about between the time that the Hebrew people said, "Here is our Bible," and it's finished, right? And the time that the New Testament began, the time Jesus was born, etc. And so this much is Apocrypha, and this little portion over here is the New Testament. Now, the New Testament takes place from Jesus' birth to a time after his death. The book of Acts is the second chapter of Luke, talking about what happened after the crucifixion and the resurrection, what happened to the followers of Jesus. And the book of Revelation, which I'm sure you all have heard of, and if you're a teenager, you should read it. I'm telling you, it's the perfect book of the Bible for a young person to get started with. It is a political treatise written on the island of Patmos by a man named John of Patmos. And it talks about God's influence in the world, and it's contrasted over and against the Roman Empire, but in such ways that the Roman Empire is just those things that work against God in the book of Revelation, but without being called the Roman Empire. So in one cases you have the sea serpent with 7 big humps coming out of the water like this. Those are the 7 hills of Rome, right? And so it's very interesting to read it. It's really graphic. It has wonderful language. So starting with let's talk about the New Testament. The New Testament is the story of Jesus' life. Some of the books of the New Testament, the 4 Gospels make up the majority of the New Testament, or a good portion of the New Testament. Let's see. This much of the New Testament are the Gospels. The Gospels are the story of Jesus' life, but they don't all start at the same place. Mark starts with his baptism and his ministry, so he's never a child in Mark. Luke starts with his birth. Matthew also starts with his birth in a slightly different set of details. And so let me tell you that the 4 writers of the Gospels were 4 leaders of 4 different communities. None of them knew Jesus. The earliest gospel was written in about 50 AD, and that was Mark. And Jesus had already, it had already been 30 years since the resurrection, or 25. So, and Mark never makes any claim to have known Jesus. What they're doing is they're writing for their community, like I would write a story for you guys, to tell you all about Jesus so that you would be able to know. Almost every group of followers of Jesus had a gospel. There were hundreds of them, and they shared them. They would copy them out by hand and share them with their friends, or share them with the next town over, or whatever. When it was time to put the Bible together, the ones that had had the largest circulation and more people had read and seemed to... In the Gospel of John, the story is told from a different perspective. Mark, Luke, and Matthew tell a chronological story of the life of a man. John tells a spiritual biography. It's completely different. So when we're reading the gospel, we read from one gospel, typically, most of the Sundays in a year. And the next year we go to another one, a different one, in a 3-year cycle. John is saved for special occasions. So all the big things like Easter and Christmas and so forth, we hear from John. And occasionally we hear from John anyway, just stuck in there every once in a while. But so how did they come to be so similar? Well, here's the deal. There were some writings that had, first of all, let me tell you that it was considered an honor, that you honored someone if you wrote something and signed their name to it. Today, that would be so awful. But it was considered a way of honoring someone if you wrote something that you thought was really exceptional and you put somebody else's name on it. So we have all these letters in the New Testament from Paul, many of which were not actually written by Paul. But it's not that hard to tell. Any scholar can tell by the original language who wrote it, or close to who wrote it anyway. But, so we have these 3 synoptic gospels. And it was very common for people to keep lists of the sayings of famous people or people they admired. Such kind of like if you had a friend who you thought was wise, and every time they said something wise, you wrote it down so that you would be able to remember it. It's kind of like that. And so those lists of sayings were passed around, and they were pretty much available to people all over the place. It's very clear that the writers of the Gospels all had, especially Mark to start with, because he was the first one to write, but they all had copies of the lists of sayings of Jesus. There were also lists of sayings of other famous people, other people that were highly regarded in the communities, and those many are still available to read as well, if that was something that you wanted to research. There was also the Didache. The Didache was a little booklet that told you how to worship. Most worship happened in houses, and the people who were leading worship didn't have any, they didn't have a book that told them how the service was supposed to go like we do, right? And so there was this little booklet that told you about how to have a worship service. That was called the Didache. And there was the Z source. The Z source was some kind of a document. We don't have a copy of it, and we don't know exactly what it was. It's called Z because the word in German for source starts with Z, and the German scholars were the first ones to talk about it. But the Z source very clearly was sort of a kind of a forerunner of a gospel. We don't know where it came from. We don't know who wrote it. There are groups, some really highly respected groups of biblical scholars who have tried to create the Z source by going backwards into it, backing up through the Bible, through the Gospels, into the Z source and try to make sense of it. But, it hasn't succeeded, so we can leave it like that. So what happened was Mark sat down and wrote using these kinds of things and the stories that he'd been told. And then Matthew and Luke both had copies of Mark as well as the same resources that Mark had. And so they were each writing for their own community. There was no such thing as plagiarism. And there was no such thing, come on in, come in. There wasn't any such thing as not being a good idea to take somebody else's ideas. And so when they wrote for their community, they wanted it to be the whole story. So they used everything they could find to write those stories. So we get three different versions of Jesus' life, but many of the stories are exactly the same in one or the other of the two or three of the synoptic gospels. John is another thing over there. It's another book of the Bible. Like I said, it is a story of Jesus' life, but it's much more of a spiritual biography, whereas the three synoptic gospels are chronological stories. So we read them all. We read them all in our services. When the people come up here and read. Every service we have a portion from the Old Testament, usually from the prophets, not always, but usually from one of the prophets, Isaiah being the primary prophet. And I say that only because the book of Isaiah is about 5 times as long as any of the other books of the prophets. So there's a lot of material attributed to Isaiah, probably not all by Isaiah. Then we read a psalm, which is also, the Psalms are also from the Old Testament. And then we read an epistle. Now the epistles come in the Bible, they come after the Gospels. They're the last portion, this little portion of the Bible. And they're the letters that were written typically by Paul. Now, Paul didn't know Jesus either, but he felt like he was called to be a disciple. And so his call, he believed, was to go to the Gentiles all over Asia Minor and start churches and spread the gospel. So he did that. And he started the church at Ephesus and the church at Thessalonica and a church at Rome and many others. And we have all at Corinth, of course, because we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, all these letters to churches. So he would stay there for a while, maybe a year, and get the church going, pick out leaders, help them learn what to do, and he would move on, but he would keep track of them by writing these letters to them. And many of those letters we still have. And that's because the churches themselves treasured them so much that they preserved them. And then there are some additional ones that may or may not have been written by Paul, probably weren't, but his name was on them, and they are considered Pauline at least. And they're also part of the epistles. The word epistle simply means letter. Now, if you go to the church at Ephesus right now today, I think it's in Turkey, they have all of the documents of their church back to the 1st century, all the way back to the 1st century. And as the church grew, they started having what we call canons of the church. They started making rules for their church. Their canons didn't spread to the whole church. It was the rules for their church. And in the late 5th century, there's an entry in a Greek entry in the canons at Ephesus that says that from this point forward, female presbyters, who are priests, could no longer become bishops. Now that's interesting because although it was quite clear, it's quite clear in the Bible that women were the leaders of worship in the very early church, in house churches, frequently. The teaching has been that women were not allowed, that priests were always men, and women were not allowed to be priests. Clearly in Ephesus, where it says that female presbyters, okay, so that means female priests, couldn't become bishops anymore, but it doesn't say, and that was in like 560, which would mean that it was 460, which would mean it was in the 5th century. It's pretty late. I mean, it's really an interesting thing, and I only know that because I had a professor who, he and his wife, for great fun, their great weekly excursion to have a good time was to go meet with their friends and translate ancient Greek. So they did that on Wednesday nights, like playing bridge or something. They did that on Wednesday nights, and on Thursday morning he would come in and tell us what they had read they were reading the canons of the church at Ephesus. And he came in one day so excited about this new information because, what they would do is they would take home copies of the canon, and they would each translate the ancient Greek. It was Koine Greek, and then they would come back and compare their translations, right? That was their fun time. Theologians can be pretty weird, really weird in some cases. So my point here is for you to understand that when and so after the epistle, we also read a portion of the gospel. And so what we're doing when we're doing those readings in the service is we're taking a little piece from each of the major parts of the Bible and putting it together around some kind of theme. Now the theme might be really clear. The reason for those particular choices might be really clear, but it might not. Sometimes the theme is a little bit esoteric or something and not quite clear. But don't worry, some priest is going to sit there and try to figure out a way to bring it all together in a sermon. That's the point. In the Episcopal Church, the priests are expected, not required, but expected to preach about the readings. You can take a day off and preach about something else if you need to or you want to, like the stewardship campaign or something. But typically, most priests on most Sundays are preaching on the lessons, and everyone in the church around the world, the Anglican Communion exists in every continent in the world, are all reading the same readings. And so the conversations that are happening have some cohesion across the church. Lots of churches don't read that much. They read some portion of Scripture that the minister intends to preach about. And it can be as little as a word, a single word. So notice one more time that I said that everything that is necessary for salvation can be found in Holy Scripture, but I didn't say that everything in Holy Scripture is necessary for salvation. The Old Testament in particular was a series of told stories, oral stories, that were eventually written down, but they had been spoken stories for millennia before they were written down. And so in different areas of the Hebrew countryside, the story might be told in a slightly different way. If someone asks if everything in the Bible is true, I try to make a distinction between what's true and what's truth. Even the most outlandish story, like Jonah and the whale, has great truth to teach us whether or not that actually happened. Right? You understand what I mean? It is a story with a lesson. And the lesson in Jonah is that you can't run away from God. And it's probably a necessary lesson. But on the other hand, you know how you say, if somebody's got themselves in a mess, you can say they're in a pickle? Have you ever heard that? That's a phrase in English. Well, at that time, the phrase was, they're in a fish. And so I'm sure that must have been the story behind why Jonah had to be eaten by a fish, right? And it really never says a whale. It says a big fish. So there are all kinds of things like that. Is that story necessary for salvation? No. Is it worth reading? Sure. Because the idea of, people are constantly trying to run away from God in the world. Every one of us at some moment in our lives would just rather not pay attention to anything God thinks right this minute. And that's another form of running away, right? So, sure, it's a story about something that's very human and happens to people all the time. Even if we don't have to be vomited on the beach like Jonah. Have you ever read Jonah, the book of Jonah? Yeah? It's pretty interesting. So that was, oh dear, I've lost my piece of paper. That was the, actually that's not what I've lost my book. That's the first part, the part about the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament as containing all things necessary to salvation. The Apostles' Creed as the baptismal symbol and the Nicene Creed as the sufficient statement of the Christian faith. I've talked about this before in church. I don't know who was there that day, but if there is something in the creed that you don't in fact believe, you are not required to say it. You know when I stand out here and we say the creed, I believe, or we believe, I believe the Apostles' Creed is I believe, and the Nicene Creed is we believe. If there's something in there that just you can't wrap your head around and you don't want it to be part of the creed, just close your mouth when that part comes. Or you can say it because it's part of our history. It's part of who the church is in a big general way. Surely, the question of virgin birth is something that lots of people struggle with. There are people who struggle with the idea of the Holy Spirit coming upon Mary, that is abusive in some way, or they perceive that to be. I believe that frequently that has to do with that person's own experiences. However, the church never, ever intends to make people uncomfortable in that way. There are other ways that we do intend to make people uncomfortable, but not in that way. Not in a way of making you feel disrespected or abused. And so it's very, times have changed. That prayer has been said for 1,600 years now. the way people think about things has changed. Images may or may not be still apropos. But that doesn't mean that we throw it out, because it holds this mountain of good intention by so many people for so many, many years. So we're probably going to continue to say the Creed in the Episcopal Church. But if you want to say the Apostles' Creed instead, you can do that. Don't scream it, just read it. If you're going against the flow, just don't, you don't have to make a big point. Just do what is right for you. Or you can just be quiet if the Creed causes you problems. Now, lots of you probably haven't ever thought about the Creed causing you a problem, but some people have. And some people in this church have told me that they have trouble coming to church because of the Creed. So don't make that a stumbling block for yourself. Make yourself able to be comfortable in your own church and do the thing that's necessary for that. The next thing on this list is, we believe that all who have been duly baptized with water in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost are members of the Holy Catholic Church. That has become very important to us, because in 1979, when the new prayer book was written, it's really just a retranslation of the 1928 prayer book, which was the first prayer book was written by Cranmer in 1546, I think, and it's just been revised. It put into new vernacular, new language as time goes by, but it's still the same. I mean, it still says the same thing. But in 1979, when the new prayer book was put in the pews, one of the changes was that you didn't have to be confirmed anymore to take communion, because we have always believed that being baptized made you a member of the church. And if you are in fact a member of the church, you should be entitled to everything the church has to offer, including including communion. So now, that's a pretty significant change. When I was growing up, you had to grow up and be 13 before you could take communion when you were confirmed. Now you can take communion on the day of your baptism, even if you're a tiny infant. And one of the things about that is that it's not our understanding of communion that makes communion effective. It's the power of God that makes communion effective. And so the fact that a newborn may not understand the meaning of communion is no reason why God can't cause that communion to bring grace to that child. So now we do that. You can see how that plays out in history. And finally, that in all things of human ordering or human choice relating to the modes of worship and discipline or to the traditional customs, the church is ready in the spirit of love and humility to forego all preferences of her own. And, I'm sorry, that was the first one in the first version of the quadrilateral. The two sacraments, baptism and the supper of the Lord, ministered with unfailing use of Christ's words. Another thing that happened in the 1979 prayer book was that instead of 10 sacraments, we now have 2 sacraments and, 7. Instead of 7 sacraments, we now have 2 sacraments and 5 sacramental rites. Because actually only 2 of the sacraments were begun by Jesus, all the rest of them were created by the church. And that is a significant difference. So they've been reallocated. And then finally, the historic episcopate. All right. Questions? I feel like a fire hose. Does anybody have questions? Go on.
What was in the Z source that you were talking about? What did it talk about?
I think that it talks about, I think some of the miracles were in it. We don't really know. And it's just that there were some things that, it appears that there was some other source, because when you take the other things that we do have a good idea of what was in them, we still are missing a bunch of stuff that came out in Mark's gospel, right? After Mark's gospel, there's a little bit added to each gospel. So they had, each gospel writer had the basic information in those sources. They also had maybe some of their own, some new other stuff, maybe something their grandparents told them, a story their grandparents, you know what I mean? Anything, could have been anything. We do nowadays have a lot more gospels, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, that have shown up in new discoveries of ancient documents. So we have always had Eusebius. Eusebius was an historian, a first century historian, maybe a second century historian. I'm thinking second century historian, who wrote a lot of history about the church. And so, for example, we had passages of the Gospel of Thomas quoted in Eusebius's history, but we'd never seen the actual thing, and we'd certainly never seen the whole thing. And then, this is a fascinating story, so I'm going to tell you. It's fun. In 1964, in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, there was a man, a scholar, walking down the street, and he saw a kid running the other way, and he had under his arm a codex. A codex is like a book. It usually would have lambskin cover and parchment pages, and it would be sewn together. And he asked him where he got it. And he said he found it in the desert in a jar. And the scholar said, "Do you have any others?" And he said, "Sure, I have lots of them, and my mom uses them for firewood." So they went back to his house, to the child's house, and the scholar paid the mother for the books. There were whole bunches of them. When they say jar, they're talking about an urn about this big around and about that tall, buried in the desert. And sometimes they're uncovered when the wind blows the sand away from on top of them, because the sand moves all the time. And so one of them was the Gospel of Thomas. And so, but it wasn't the original Gospel of Thomas. It was a translation from Greek to Coptic, but to a particular time frame of Coptic. Coptic is the language of the North African Christians, like Ethiopia and Eritrea area over there. And so they sent it to Princeton, where there was a man who was a Coptic scholar, and to be translated. And he's working, he's been working on it for a long time, and he turns the page and he realizes that there's a page missing. And he thought, I can't even believe this is true, but the style of this writing is really just like that page we have in the museum. And he went to the Princeton Museum and took a page out of a display, and it was the missing page, and they had survived simultaneously but not together. And just astonishing, really. So we have now the whole Gospel of Thomas, and that happened in the late 20th century.
So what credence is given to those Gospels?
There's nothing about those Gospels that is necessarily less important than the Gospels in the canon of the Bible, except for the incredible amount of weight that these gospel lessons, these Gospels in the Bible have had for so long, and what the influence that they've had on the development of spiritual lives and the development of history and so forth. So they're not as important as the ones in the Bible, but they are important. And they're important because, again, they were written for some community, and you get to see a much broader, the farther you go, the more you read of them, the more you see the varieties of Christian worship. There was not a whole lot of similarity necessarily between, what we know now about early Christian worship is that it was really different everywhere you went. And we thought, for years it was taught that this piece of paper right here, this document right here, is the earliest service written down that we have. And so this must have been how everybody was worshiping. Turns out it was a wedding. It wasn't even a regular service. So, that was, for several centuries, that was considered the standard. And then it was determined that it was a wedding. And
so do they bring, do any of those other gospels, like you talk about the synoptic gospels, and then one that is different, telling more of a religious story, do any of those add more dimensions, or are they, again, in the synoptic,
they're pretty much, they do bring a different dimension. In particular, because religion had not taken on the identity that it did later on. So there were lots of people whose thinking didn't follow along with everyone else's, and there were groups of people whose thinking didn't follow along with everyone else's. And so you get, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, there is a little bit of magical thinking, different from the miracles of Christ, much more along the lines of magical thinking. I don't know. Special knowledge. Some people have special knowledge that other people don't have the ability to have. That kind of thing. That is sometimes referred to as Gnosticism. I don't really know that the gospel. For me, the Gospel of Thomas is no more Gnostic than the Gospel of John, but it has a reputation for being more Gnostic. Gnosticism was considered a heresy, but not very well defined. So it was a heresy that you could kind of apply to anybody you didn't like, kind of a thing. There were lots of fights. Some of them divided the world. Others just divided people on the other side of the street. So it's a really good question, not very easy to answer. And each one probably is a story unto itself. The answer to your question would be different for each one of them individually as well. Some of them are much more with the party line than others. But that just means that there were communities that were more with the party line than others. So, but we know that because if you study the history of heresies, there's always a group of people following somebody that has a weird idea or an idea that wasn't acceptable to the Christian authorities. And as time went on, things became more rigid, more specific. This is what we believe, this. There's an astronomical amount of writing out of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries that set what the theology of the church forever. And council meetings like the Council at Nicaea, where some people's ideas were just thrown out, and they probably went somewhere else and became something else, like a Zoroastrian. I can't say that word, I'm sorry. So that's a really long discussion. I don't know if I've done it any justice at all, but it was a great question. I have some things you could read if you're interested in that. I have hundreds and hundreds of books, and I'm particularly interested in that myself, so I have some books about that. So I was going to talk to you about the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible, but we got through the Bible pretty much. And how the Episcopal Church uses and what they consider about the Bible. I think the Bible's really important to us, but I would say that there is virtually, I can't say there's no place in the Anglican Communion, but there's certainly no place in the American version of the Anglican Communion, the Episcopal Church, where every word of the Bible is considered to be sacredly true. There are religions, there are groups of people who believe that, and I don't really know how you can do that, because if you read the first 2 chapters of the Bible, the very first 2 chapters of Genesis, it tells 2 different stories of Adam and Eve, and they're not the same. They're not the same at all. And so, I mean, in one of them, God creates Adam, and then he takes Adam's rib and makes Eve as Adam's helpmate. In the other one, he creates male and female, he creates them. That's a substantial difference. I think both of them are interesting, and both of them have something to teach us about. That's where I make a differentiation between something that's true and something that's truthful, that is full of truth. I think that stories that teach us something can be completely full of truth without having ever happened. There's nothing about dinosaurs. Well, there's a little bit about sea monsters, you know. Children always ask me where the dinosaurs fit in all that. You know. Another interesting thing to think about, actually fascinating, and maybe someday we could do a Bible study about this, is the Popol Vuh, which is the story of creation of the Inca. No, the Maya. It's the story of the Maya story of creation, and how remarkably similar it is to the biblical story of creation. That's just pretty astonishing. So, if you ever think, oh, what shall I read tonight? You can get a Kindle version of the Popol Vuh on Amazon. And I think it's free, but it might be 99 cents or something like that. It's Populvu, 2 words. Anyway, like I said, too much of a fire hose. Does anybody have any more questions? Because it's time to go home. Well, next week we'll get finished. So, or for later. Next week we're going to do the Book of Common Prayer and some of the difference between Anglican theology and the theology of other churches. So that's next week. And next week will be the last week. If I don't have your information on one of those little information pieces of paper, please let me know. Oh, good? Good? Because I can give you another one. You don't have to keep up with the first one. And I need them if you want to be confirmed, but if you just came for fun, that's okay too.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I wondered about the Bible expanding.